Hello and welcome back to Geek and Speak, the Geek and Seek podcast. Today we have an interesting one. We are talking about how to play around annoying staples. Maybe a more accurate title for this episode would be how to play around soft stacks, like cards that aren't really stacks, right? We're not talking about Stasis Orb or anything, but these are actually staples. These are all cards that like you can kind of play around. You're going to see them in a lot of decks. They're high up on EDH rec rankings and stuff like that, but they're really annoying. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you can lessen the blow on some of these if you end up playing against them. So joined with me today is Preston. Preston, how's it going, man?
Good. This will be a fun one to talk about because these cards aren't fun. So I think complaining about them will be good for the soul.
I don't know. I like a couple of these. There's a couple of these that I like to play. Then we also have Jason with us. Jason, how's it going, man?
It's going good. I think that this episode is going to be important for people because it's important to know how to play around these types of cards and these types of effects, because these are often things that will lead people to win games.
I agree. I am your host, Morgan. I'm also excited for this one just because it's really easy to just ignore a lot of these cards we're going to talk about, and you just keep doing your own thing, and then you're pushing the other person ahead. So we're going to tell you to, hey, slow the frick down, and, we'll get control of the situation and go from there. So if you would like to support the show, you could do all the YouTube algorithm stuff like liking this video, leaving comments, subscribing if you're not subscribed already, and checking out all of our other videos. This is episode 62 of our podcast. We also have like 30-something episodes of Commander gameplay. We have other stuff going on as well. And if you want to go the extra mile, you can head over to patreon.com/geekandseekyoutube. Within a couple weeks, we will be having a new gameplay episode that's only for the patrons. That'll be really fun when it comes out. And then we also have a Discord if you want to join us there, talk Magic, all that good stuff. You can find a link to that in the description. Favorite comment of the week. This is I think this was from Preston's Eladamri deck tech. This is Starmonda88. Preston, I think you're the bee's knees. Thanks for this deck tech. Yeah, we were trying to amp up the deck techs. We're trying to do that more often for when we play decks on our Commander gameplay series. I just like the bee's knees. I like that in waves we get old lingo to come back into circulation. And I just think it's amusing.
Yes, keep feeding my ego comments. I need it. I need this. That's all I have.
It's okay, buddy. And then as far as deck techs, you can expect a few more coming soon because we just recently released the Bloomborough episode of Upkeep, our Commander gameplay series. And that was, you guys have been so kind, and thank you so much for supporting that. That's already one of our better performing episodes from the last, I think this year. I think that it's one of the better performing episodes this year. So thank you so much for checking that out, sharing it with your friends, all that. We'll be doing deck techs for all of the decks you saw on that episode. Okay, let's hop into our main topic. So we have a couple categories we're going to hit, and a couple cards in each category. And we're not going to talk about literally every card. We're just going to hit like the couple like most popular ones that get the gist across. We're going to start off with hard to pay taxes. So cards that give you an option when an effect happens, and if you pay it, the effect won't happen. So the two that I feel like are the hardest to pay that we see very often are Rhystic Study and Smothering Tide. So Rhystic Study is a 3-mana enchantment that says whenever an opponent casts a spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 1. And then Smothering Tithe is a 4-mana enchantment that says whenever an opponent draws a card, that player may pay 2. If the player doesn't, you create a treasure token. So Rhystic Study, it's going to give your opponents cards if you don't pay when you cast things. And then Smothering Tithe is going to give your opponents treasures when you draw cards if you don't pay. So what do you guys think about these cards when they hit the table, and how do you let them affect how you play the game?
So when it comes to Smothering Tide, it's difficult because 2 mana for one card is a lot. And starting your turn off with 2 less mana than you could have, it it really can throw off people's turns, especially when they're looking at their hand and they're like, all right, I know exactly what I'm going to do. I have it all planned out. Then the person right before their turn casts a Smothering Tide, and they're like, well, crap. Now I have to reform my whole process of what I'm going to do this turn. But I think that unless you're in a situation where you need your mana to like play something immediately that's going to help you catch up with the rest of the table, like if you're just behind the other 3 players and you need to do stuff on your turn so that you can catch up to everyone, give them the treasure. But outside of that, like if you're just as set up as everybody else, you should pay the 2 for the 1 card. If you have to draw a couple other cards in your turn, maybe you don't pay for 1 or 2 other cards. But the first one on your turn when the Smothering Tithe comes down, if you can pay for it, you should always pay for it.
Smothering Tithe, I think, is harder because it also is your draw for turn. Like a couple of the cards that target card draw won't count your first draw for your turn, the one you draw during your draw step. Smothering Tithe still will ask you to pay the 2 then. And that is really hard. I think that the treasure token is often not as good as the card draw from like Rhystic Study, but I think Rhystic Study is much easier to play around because if you just think about it as all my spells cost 1 more to cast, it's a lot easier to play around. And I think people should be doing that. I think people get caught up in, I don't want to pay for Rhystic Study because I want to do my thing, but then you're drawing your opponent so many cards. So I think you should always pay for Rhystic Study, and I think you should think long and hard before you just not pay for Smothering Tithe as well. What do you think, Preston?
I think you should pay for Smothering Tithe. You have to pay for Rhystic Study. Unless you need that 1 mana to basically win the game that turn, pay the 1 every single time. Like, unless it is going to literally stop you from participating in the game, 1 mana is always worth keeping them off that card draw.
Yeah,
Especially if everyone
absolutely.
doesn't pay it, like, it goes off so fast. If everyone doesn't pay for Smothering Tithe, you can lose the game very quickly, but they might not have anything to do with it. If they're drawing 15 cards a rotation, they're going to have something. They just are. No one draws that many cards and then doesn't have something to do.
Well, so Preston, you might not remember this because you weren't in this episode, but we did an episode of Upkeep where everyone played artifact decks, and Jason dropped Heuristic Study. I was the only person responsible enough to pay for it. So I ended up dying first in that game, and I think a large part of that was because I left a lot of my mana to the Heuristic Study instead of furthering my own game plan. But then the other 2 guys got wrecked by Jason on the backswing because they let him draw probably a dozen cards over the course of the game. So it's this awkward situation of even if you are responsible, it might not matter because who's to say your opponents are going to be responsible as well. So I think this is one of those cards, like, for the most part, I say hold on to your removal till the absolute last second. But cards like Smothering Tithe and Rhystic Study, I think if you have a way to remove it, you just remove it right away, even if you'd rather wait. Because, like sometimes you could wait to kick off your removal spell if you're like, yeah, that hurts me, but it hurts them more, so I'll leave it for now. You can't do that with this because you can't rely on your opponents to be responsible and pay for it.
Also, how many targets are there going to be that are better options for removal? Like, there's probably some, but in the average game, these are going to be the best hits for your removal. They work on them.
Yeah, it definitely can be game dependent on what you want to remove the most, but Rhystic Study is going to take that most of the time if it's on the battlefield because it's just too powerful of an ability, and you have to pay for it, like they're saying, because if you don't, you're just going to drown in your opponent's value. It's very backbreaking and hard to overcome when someone draws 5 cards like in one person's turn and then draws 2 cards on the next person's turn and then draws 3 cards on the third person's turn and then they draw a card for turn. Like, one rotation, if it's played in the right situation in a game, depending on what the other decks are trying to do, you can draw so many cards just having it on the table for one rotation. It can do so much damage.
The Smothering Tithe, I think, is the harder one to pay for, right? Like
100%.
Rhystic Study, again, you just pretend your spells cost 1 more. but like you are just going to draw cards over the course of the game, whether you are intentionally doing it or not. Smothering Tithe becomes very hard. So I think Smothering, if both are on the battlefield and you only have one removal spell, I think you remove the Smothering Tithe. But hopefully you could just get rid of both of them. All right. What about easier to pay taxes? So this would be cards like Mystic Remora and Esper Sentinel. So Mystic Remora is a 1-mana enchantment with cumulative upkeep of 1. And whenever, I guess I should read the reminder text on cumulative upkeep. At the beginning of your upkeep, put an age counter on this permanent, then sacrifice it unless you pay its upkeep cost for each age counter on it. So for every turn you want to keep it around, you have to pay an extra mana. And then whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 4. And then, so it's kind of like Rhystic Study, but it only checks non-creatures, and it is 4, but Mystic Remora is not likely to stick around nearly as long as something like Rhystic Study. And then there's also Esper Sentinel, which is a 1-mana artifact creature human soldier, 1/1. Whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, draw a card unless that player pays X, where X is Esper Sentinel's power. Which I think is also not that bad because you can... Often X is just going to be 1. Sometimes they're going to buff it up in some way, but often X is just 1. So just treat your first non-creature spell as costing 1 more, and you should be fine. And then Mystic Remora, I think you can usually get around just because eventually your opponent has to stop paying the cumulative upkeep. So just slow ball your non-creature spells. But what do you guys think about these two?
Yeah, the best way to get around these types of effects is just don't play your non-creature spells. Mystic Remora especially, because if nobody who plays the Mystic Remora draws in one rotation because nobody played a non-creature spell, which happens fairly often, that person is likely to waste another mana to keep that Mystic Remora around in hopes of drawing at least one extra card. That second turn, or that second time that they have to pay that cumulative upkeep cost for 2, now it's like, oof, I've just paid 4 mana. How many cards did I get out of it? People are going to be less likely to pay it at that point. So slowing down is the right way to go when faced against these types of cards. Esper Sentinel, because it's a creature and an artifact, plenty of ways to remove it.
Dies to everything.
Dies to so many things. And yeah, you do maybe have to worry about those creature-based decks that are going to play a lot of Anthem effects, so it's going to enter as like a 4/4, and now you have to pay 4 for your first non-creature spell each turn. It still dies to so many things. And most of the time, it's going to come down as a 1/1, and you have to pay a 1. So it's really not that big of a deal compared to cards like Rhystic Study, where paying the 1 is like absolutely every time. And if it's just the first one, maybe you don't have to pay the 1 because they're only getting 1 card out of it. So I think that even if you do decide not to pay for it, the downside and the value that your opponents are getting, it's not going to be anything compared to like Rhystic Study or Smothering Tithe.
I think one of the best things you can do specifically with Esper Sentinel is wait until you can cast multiple non-creature spells in a turn. So that way, if they even if they get 1, because you just can't pay that 1, you can still play your other non-creatures since it only checks the first one. So that's a pretty easy way to like play around it to where they're still getting some value, but they're not running away with the game they would with the other ones.
So, I would still wait till I just have the 1 extra mana so I could still pay for it though, because these effect I think there's a percentage of the time where that mentality is correct. Like if you are about to do something that's going to put you so far ahead that you're just going to kill the person who has the Esper Sentinel, sure, whatever. But I think the right way to do it is just always just slow down and pay for it, because what you're doing, if you're just playing a Rampant Growth or you're just playing a Talisman or something, that's not worth drawing your opponent a card. And I think most Commander players fall into the trap of just they're like, well, I'm here to play spells, so I'm just going to play my spells, even if it draws my opponent's cards. And I just think that's wrong. If you want to increase your chances of winning, I just think that's wrong.
But I think that there are certain situations. It's definitely less. It's not as bad for you if you let your opponent draw the one card from like Esper Sentinel, because you could be in a situation where you need to cast that Rampant Growth to get another land onto the battlefield, or you need to cast that Cultivate so that you can get a land onto the battlefield and into your hand, and then play that land for turn because you haven't drawn a land in 2 turns. So because you're going to be in situations like that over the course of the times that you play Commander. Letting them draw one card in a situation like that probably isn't going to hurt you as much. Now, with Mystic Remora, it's not the same because it's every non-creature spell. So that one, it's definitely slow down and just don't play your stuff until it's gone, until it goes away, until somebody can deal with it, whatever. But I think for Esper Sentinel, it's not as bad. So if you're in those desperate situations, Esper Sentinel's not going to hurt you as much.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on Mystic Remora? I feel like we haven't talked about that one as much, because 4 is a lot to pay for it. But how many times do you think the cumulative upkeep is actually going to get paid?
Like I said, I don't think that anyone's going to pay more than the second time for it, depending on how many cards they've drawn. Because
eventually they're going to use their mana for something else, right?
You pay for it the first time, and it's like, okay, I've spent 2 mana, and even if I draw 1 card from it, that's a good return. 2 mana for 1 card, that's decent. If you're now on the second one and you're paying 4 mana to draw 1 card, that's the worst Harmonize I've ever heard of. That's horrible. So I think that with Mystic Remora, like I said before, you just slow down and you just don't play that stuff. If you have to play 1, like I said, in that situation where you need to get more lands onto the battlefield because you don't have any to play, letting them draw 1 is not going to be bad. But if you can prevent that, just don't play your non-creature spells. Play your commander and pass. Do something like that, and wait until they don't want to pay for the Mystic Remora anymore. Let them make the mistake by wasting mana into a card that's not going to draw them as much as they want it to.
Yeah, I agree with that, but
getting rid of a blue player's mana specifically, which is what is important.
True.
Getting rid
that's
of
mana they're not
mana
saving up for. That's mana they're not saving up for a counterspell or something. I would argue that it's even okay to miss a land drop. Like you use the example, well, what if you need to cast the Cultivate to catch up or whatever? I would argue, unless that the person with the Mystic Remora is the Simic player, and while they're paying for this, they're also going Burr and gain all their lands. Unless it's that, I would still argue it's okay to miss the land drop, because if you have a decent amount of lands in your deck, you'll just draw them. You'll be okay.
No,
you'll miss 1 or
I
2.
disagree.
Okay. Jason plays 8 lands in a deck, so he has.
Yeah.
I think that is the wrong way to look at it, because the player that has it, first of all, if you're just going to miss a land drop and say, you know what, I'm just not going to play this spell so I don't have a land, you're putting yourself a turn behind everyone else at the table when you have an opportunity to at least stay on par with the other 2 players at the table who aren't playing the Mystic Remora and Esper Sentinel. Choosing to miss a land drop when you desperately need a land on the battlefield is 100% of the time a mistake, in my opinion. I really just don't think that playing that one spell so that, excuse me, I just don't think that not playing that one spell to prevent your opponent from drawing 1 card so that you don't intentionally put yourself a turn behind everyone, I think that choosing to do that, to not stay even with everyone else at the table, that's just a mistake to me. If you don't do that, then you're even less likely to win the game than you already were.
So I think that's a interesting dynamic, because I think that there's times where that's true or not true, because my mentality is I'm always going to pay or play around if I can, unless I'm just about to kill that person. But Jason's saying that,
that's what I'm saying.
Sometimes he'll just do it anyways.
No, that's a situation where you can't. Like, you're saying can isn't just like having the ability to do it. It's like, no, you have to think about, what is this going to mean for me in my game if I actually pay for this right now, instead of staying at least even with the rest of the table. You're putting yourself, like, in that situation where you're not playing a land, you're literally putting yourself a turn behind everyone. Everyone basically got an extra land drop that you didn't get. And having an extra land drop, ask the green players. That could be just as powerful as drawing a card. So
I can see that
I
argument.
I just think choosing not to play a land just to prevent them from drawing one card is a mistake.
So next up we have passive taxes. So there's quite a few cards that have effects like these. Cards that are just going to sit on the battlefield and accrue value as normal game actions are happening. So the two we're going to talk about today, just as examples, are Smuggler's Share and Trouble in Pairs. Smuggler's Share is a 3-mana enchantment. At the beginning of each end step, draw a card for each opponent who drew 2 or more cards this turn. Then create a treasure token for each opponent who had 2 or more lands enter the battlefield under their control this turn. And then Trouble in Pairs is a 4-mana enchantment that says if an opponent would begin an extra turn, that player skips that turn instead. And then whenever an opponent attacks you with 2 or more creatures, draws their second card each turn, or casts their second spell each turn, you draw a card. These might be the hardest ones to play around, if you ask me. Like, at least of the ones we've talked about so far. Maybe there's some later on our list that are harder to play around, but I feel like maybe these are the hardest to play around because these are just things that are going to happen. Like you are probably going to accidentally draw other cards, even if you don't intentionally do it. Like maybe you have a Phyrexian Arena already out. You can't get around this now. Or maybe you have cards that say when this creature attacks or whatever, draw a card. You know, you just are going to have things on the battlefield that are going to draw you extra cards. And then you have like your fetch lands. That's going to count as another land entering from Smuggler's Share. It's kind of hard to slow roll not playing more than one spell, especially when you get to the late game. So I think these are actually like, yes, you can technically play around them, but they're so brutally hard to play around.
You don't really need to play around the second half of Smuggler's Share. 2 lands is typically better than a treasure. Like, if you're somehow doing that enough to where they're making a bunch of treasures, you're probably still ahead because you're putting out 2 lands in a turn, so I don't think that's really much of an issue.
I agree with that. Other than fetch lands, like fetch lands are still gonna trigger that. Which
but how many fetch lands do you even have in your deck?
Sure, but I just think that
twice,
I just think that that's an unfortunate part of it. But otherwise, I would agree. If you're actually ramping your lands, that's probably more upside. But what do you think about these?
To me, I think that even if we're talking about Smuggler's Share still, I think even the first part of it isn't as bad depending on how many cards that player has already drawn. Because at worst, at like the best for this card, when it's, well, for you, not for your opponent, but the best scenario for you is that, you know, nobody pays for it, but it's like even, or nobody triggers it. But even if someone does trigger it, like if one person at the table triggers it, the only thing that happened is the person, like the opponent who played this card, just drew the same amount of cards that that player did on their turn. Like if they drew 2 cards, on their turn, then really, if they're the only one that did it, the player who owns it just kind of also drew at least 2 cards because they'll get their card on their turn and then the 1 card that they drew for Smuggler's Share. So
Trouble in Pairs, I think, is the better card. Like Smuggler's Share, I mostly agree that like the upside is minimal enough that like you shouldn't break your brain trying to play around it. But Trouble in Pairs, the ceiling on this is that on each player's turn it draws 3 cards. It's rarely going to be that good, but that's the ceiling of it. And I feel like that's at the level of like Ristic Study as far as how many cards it's drawing. Like I feel like it's somewhat equal as far as Ristic Study. And I think Ristic Study is easier to play around because if you just tax all your spells by 1, you're good. This is much harder.
Here's the other problem with Trouble in Pairs. You have the potential to draw from each of your opponents on one opponent's turn.
Oh, that's
because
true.
I mean,
So is the so wait, I guess the ceiling's even higher than drawing 3 cards a turn, isn't it?
yeah, because think of it this way: what if like you have trouble in pairs on the board? It's on somebody else's turn, and then they do something, and then one of your other opponents casts Arcane Denial.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's
on
true.
the next,
So I guess it's
on the
even
next,
better than what I said.
yeah. So you're immediately going to trigger it at the end of that next turn because you're going to draw 2 cards, unless you just choose not to draw 2 cards from the Arcane Denial, which you could absolutely do. But yeah, you have the potential to draw 3 cards per turn from one opponent, but 9 cards, I guess, per turn.
Well, not quite that many because your other opponents can't attack you during one person's turn, right? Only one person can trigger that part. So I guess the ceiling is 7. I guess the ceiling is 7. But that's insane. I don't think it's ever going to actually happen, but like
No, it's 9 per turn.
Because I'm thinking, because it's like each player, all
No,
three
'cause-
players can. All 3 players have the chance to cast 2 spells because if they have 2 instants.
but only
So-
only one person can attack on their turn. Like other people can't attack on other people's turns, which is the first thing that triggers it.
But for the cast their second spell each turn. Each player has an opportunity to do that on one turn, so that's 3 cards. Each player has an opportunity to draw their second card on a turn, and that could be from activated abilities or spells that you're casting. But you are right; only
So
one
that's up
person
to-
can
So
attack.
that's up to 6, and then only one person can attack.
So,
it's-
you
I was right.
you were right. Yeah. So that's you. Preston said 9. No, you were right with 7.
So okay. So if you have the Beast Within, is the answer that you hit the Trouble in Pairs instead of the Rhystic Study? Because I feel like this is so much harder to play around, and I feel like maybe it's because it's a newer card. I feel like it doesn't have the reputation that Rhystic Study has.
Yeah, I agree. Because
Do you do anything to play around this, or do you just have to like hope that you get rid of it or kill the person who has it? Because this feels
I
like
think
really hard to play around.
you get rid of it or kill the person that has it. Because I mean, even if you attack them with 2 or more creatures, not really gonna matter that they draw a card because we want them to die. So
Yeah, so my thing is if you're going to trigger one of those effects, get your money's worth. Instead of drawing the 2 cards so they draw 1, draw 8 cards. Instead of attacking with 2 creatures, attack with 16, Like
Yeah, sure.
it doesn't
Go big.
that's the thing where it doesn't match up with Rhystic Study. Rhystic Study can draw more than 1. These are only drawing 1. Like no matter how much you do.
yeah,
So
but I
that's the
mean,
difference.
how many draws are they actually going to get if you're only adding 1 extra mana to the cost of your spells?
Because I have played in games where Rhystic Study has literally drawn 0 cards. I have actually seen that. Whereas
I don't know
Trouble
that.
in Pairs,
I
I
don't-
don't think you'll ever see a game where Trouble in Pairs doesn't draw anything.
No.
Trouble in
Some
Players
food
has a
for
better
thought.
floor but a lower ceiling.
Yeah,
Maybe
that might be true.
Trouble in Pairs is probably more consistently going to draw you cards.
I think that's probably true, especially if you have responsible players. I don't think you can realistically play around it. I think you just have to try to remove it. So our next category is soft card draw hate. So these are cards that are going to say, yeah, you can still draw your cards, but if you do, there will be some kind of punishment. So the 2 example cards we have are Orcish Bowmasters and Shieldred the Apocalypse. Shieldred is a 4-mana 4/5 with Death Touch. Whenever you draw a card, you gain 2 life. Whenever an opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. And then Orcish Bowmasters is a 2-mana 1/1 with Flash. When it enters the battlefield, and whenever an opponent draws a card, except for the first one they draw, in each of their draw steps, Orcish Bowmaster deals 1 damage to any target. Then you amass Orcs 1. Bowmasters is a lot harder to play around because it has Flash. So you could the Rishkar's Expertise or whatever could already be on the stack, and then you flash this in, and it's like, oh crap, right? But like, otherwise, it's gonna sit there on the battlefield. You know it's there. Shieldred, it's gonna sit on the battlefield. You know it's there. Yeah, you're gonna have your draw for turn, but like if that 2 damage killed you, you were probably gonna lose the game anyways. So what do you guys think about these kind of effects?
I understand why you called them that, but referring to these as soft card draw hate just feels wrong on a fundamental level.
I
Like,
don't
I get
know.
it, but if you've ever seen either of these cards in action, oh, they do so much damage.
Well, isn't that just because commander players are greedy and they want to go burr? Isn't that the reason? Like, if you were responsible and you actually cared about how much damage they were dealing to you, you would just stop. You would just slow down. But commander players are just like, I'm here to go burr. So they just keep drawing their cards even though these are sitting there.
Well, with
So isn't that
Shieldred,
a commander problem?
with Shieldred, even if no one draws any extra cards, that's an 8 life swing every single turn rotation just from the one card per turn. Like, that's just really hard to deal with. So like the best thing to do with Shieldred is just to kill her as soon as possible. Orcish is a little bit better because they're not gaining life and it's only 1 damage at a time, but they're also making a big creature. So
I would say that Shieldred is probably worse because no matter what, you're gonna lose at least 2 life on your turn. Like unless somebody's skipping their draw step, you're at least gonna lose 2 life per turn, which that stacks up over time. And if you're drawing a bunch of cards on your turn, or because like you said, commander players are greedy, or if your opponent has ways to draw you cards, because you don't have to just play this in a mono black deck. You can play this in decks that are other colors, the wheel colors.
I have it.
So
I have
you
it in it. Shieldred and Orcish Bowmaster both in my Quasar deck, which is an Esper deck. Yeah.
yeah. So, um, I just think that the 1 damage from Orcish Bowmaster is not going to matter as much as losing the 2 life per draw. Because
The other thing that's worth noting about the differences is that Shieldred is only the players are losing life, right? Orcish Bowmaster, yeah, you can send that damage upstairs to their face, but you can use it to pick off their creatures and planeswalkers.
Yeah. The other thing that Orcish Bowmaster has going for it, just to kind of play devil's advocate to my point a little bit, is you can't give it infect. And then Orcish Bowmasters can start killing people with 10 damage.
honestly, the best way to play around these 2 cards is to just not play with that person anymore.
Or give Orcish Bowmaster Death Touch.
Yeah, giving the Orcish Bowmaster Death Touch, like put a Basilisk Collar or something on it, then the 1 damage kills almost anything. So, okay, to defend these cards, I have 2 points. One, they are both fragile. Neither of them have any protection. They
Shieldred is a 4/5 with Death Touch. We're not saying fragile.
Okay, but it doesn't have it doesn't have hex.
You can back easily.
Sure, but neither of them have hexproof or ward or indestructible. Like they die to everything. You can Swords to Plowshare them, and they're good Swords to Plowshare targets. You're not gonna feel bad about using a removal spell on them.
Or
But
you could steal them, play those gain
Yeah, there
control
you
of
go.
target creature stuff.
I actually did that on Arena yesterday. I stole my opponent's Shieldred, and I was like, I did it! I won the game. It actually is what won me the game. But so spoiler alert, our next category is hard card draw hate. And I'm gonna be honest, guys, I hate that category. That category makes me feel real bad. It makes me feel like a bad person. It feels bad when I play against it. If I feel like we need to have punishment for going berserk. Like if you are going to have a big explosive turn, there should be repercussions for said actions. We should teach people that their actions have consequences. And I feel like these are the better option. I like these kind of effects way more than the hard card draw hate, because these are like, okay, I'm going to let you draw the cards, but you will take damage or your stuff will take damage or whatever. So I feel like these cards should exist, and I feel like this is the better way to do it than the next category.
Yeah, I think that these cards are definitely easier to play around than the next cards that we're going to talk about. Being creatures, it's a lot easier to. Creatures are probably the easiest card type in the game to deal with. Every color has a way to deal with creatures in one way or the other. And not only that, but they all have multiple ways of doing it. You know, green might not have it as on such of a massive impact on the game. Like they don't have a whole lot of board wipe options.
No, but they have
But
creatures
as far
big
as
enough to get
targeted,
the children anyways.
yeah, like I said, they have their own ways of getting rid of the creatures. And you know what? None of them are actually preventing you from finding answers to get the creatures. So that's, my main argument for why these would be considered soft card draw.
Yeah, but these people who are playing fairly too.
Yeah, but not as bad, right?
Nowhere near as bad.
Like if you're just drawing like your card for turn and maybe one or two other cards, that's not punishing you nearly as bad as the green player who risked our expertise into the Return of the Wild Speaker. Like the green player can suck it.
You just need to
okay?
stop hating green.
I don't
You
hate
just need
green.
to stop being that guy.
I don't hate green. I'm
did
just saying if
nothing
they're
wrong
going
to anyone ever.
I don't hate green. I'm just saying that if they're going to have that explosive turn, that the other colors should have the means to say, okay, but hang on.
Yeah, no color in the game gets to do one thing with impunity.
If anything, I would say that I am annoyed that green is like so far and above the other colors on the casual level. I think that's kind of lame. So I think that the other colors having effects like this to say, okay, fine, green player, you can still do your thing, but there will be a little bit of a punishment. I think that's healthy for the game to just balance things out a bit.
I 100% agree.
And maybe these are pushed. Maybe these are maybe a little stronger than what we would like to see, but we should have more effects like this in the game. But the next category is something that I'm not so happy about, which is hard card draw hate. So the two cards we have for examples here are Notion Thief and Narset Parter of Veils. Notion Thief is a 4-mana 3/1 with flash. If an opponent would draw a card except the first one they would draw, except for the excuse me, I'm going to start over. If an opponent would draw, I started reading the actual card, and that's not the same as the Oracle text because I'm looking at the original copy of it. If an opponent would draw a card except the first one they draw in each of their draw steps, instead that player skips that draw and you draw a card. So if your opponent would draw, you get to draw instead and they don't. Narset Parter of Veils is a planeswalker. The important part here is that it has a static ability that says each opponent can't draw more than one card each turn. So Preston, if you had to choose between this and Orcish Bowmaster, what are you taking, dog?
These. I have
what?
never hated these cards. These have never been an issue for me.
Elaborate.
I have never been shut out of a game of Magic by either of these cards. You two just have skill issues. I'm sorry.
I do not believe you at all, and I think that everyone who watches this video are going to disagree with you.
Okay,
but continue.
I know why he said that. I know why he's saying that. I know why he's saying that. Preston is saying that because he plays these effects.
One time I did.
Preston plays these. He plays Notion Thieves. He plays what's the white one? The Alms Collector. Is that the one? The white one that does something similar. Preston plays these effects. That's why he's saying that.
Actually, I do think one time I did get screwed over a little bit because someone did use my Notion Thief. But, that's just fair Magic at the end of the day. I can't blame that.
These are the worst cards to play around. Like, there's not many cards that I hate more than Narset and Notion Thief. Just
I'm on a call,
awful.
Stacey.
It is so hard to overcome these things because they limit your ability to deal with them. You basically have to pray that the next card that you draw at the beginning of each of your turns is the answer to one of those cards, or at least is going to be a card that's going to put you in a position to win the game. Like, you're hoping for one of those two things. It's like, well, this either better win me the game or deal with the Narset. It does neither. So with Orcish Bowmaster and Shieldred, yeah, jeez. Yeah, drawing more cards from your deck is going to trigger them more, and it's going to cause more damage to things or cause you to lose more life. But, if you draw 3 cards and you lose 6 life from Shieldred, but that third card you drew was like an Anguished Unmaking or something, you're happy to pay the 6 life and then the cost of the Anguished Unmaking to get rid of Shieldred or get rid of, the Orcish Bowmaster and, your commander died because it dealt 3 damage to it. You're happy to sacrifice your commander to get that out of there. With Notion Thief and Narset, like, it's just top decking and praying. And that's the worst feeling in Magic. Like, the only thing that I think feels worse is if you can't tap your lands for mana. Or if those Winter Orb type of effects. Those are the only types of stuff that I think is worse than Notion Thief and Narset and like just preventing and restricting your card draw.
I will say Narset isn't as bad because you can at least draw 3 cards or 4 cards per rotation technically if you have instant speed card draw. If you have small, like, repeatable card draw, you do get to do it once per turn.
Again, I'll disagree with you there. Notion Thief is a creature and it's much easier to deal with. Narset you can swing at it, but if someone is playing that, then I would imagine that they would have ways to protect Narset.
Yeah, but
every,
I think
every
Preston's
game
point was that I think Preston's point is that if you have the right kind of card draw and the right timing and the mana to execute the plan, you technically can still draw cards around Narset, whereas you can't with Notion Thief. The problem is that Narset. So Narset is a planeswalker. To play Devil's Advocate, Narset is a planeswalker, so it's relatively easy to get rid of. You can deal damage to it in red. You can remove it with anything that hits any permanent. You can attack it. It's much easier to get rid of it. Whereas the Notion Thief, if the player with the Notion Thief, like it has 1 toughness, it dies in combat to everything. But if it's doing enough work, the player will just not block with it. They'll just not take it and they'll just keep their Notion Thief around. The problem is that Narset is both of these are just always played with wheels. I'm going to drop my Notion Thief and or my Narset, and then I'm going to play like any kind of wheel, Windfall or something. So that's where it gets annoying.
I've never done either of those, so you can't blame me too badly.
Yeah,
actually, last time Preston played his life gain deck, I had a wheel on the stack. I was playing just a good old fair wheel. I was like, you know what? Everyone's out of cards. Let's draw everyone some cards. And then Preston's like in response and flashed in the white one. So, and then Preston died like 4 turns later because everyone had enough.
Yeah, well, that's not me playing the wheel. You played the wheel. That's literally not a nice way I said.
So
Yeah.
wait, are you gonna stay on the hill that these are like not as painful as the like Shieldreds and Orcish Bowmasters? Are you gonna stay on that train?
Oh no, I think for the average player these are worse. I just said for me they've never been the biggest problem.
Okay.
Because
Now I'm going to put Notion Thief and Narset in every deck, and I'm going to put a wheel in those decks, and I'm going to show you what pain is.
I will say that depending on your timing,
wheels in with the other 2, and it would still be pretty bad. You wheel with the Shieldred out. That's also pretty.
Yeah, you tell me. We get into that
awesome.
situation. You tell me what's worse: a board wipe or having 1 card in your hand, or in the case of Notion Thief, 0 cards in your hand. How about that?
We just don't invite you back to Magic anymore. That's what happened.
No, I think we all agree that you need to be taught a lesson.
Why? I'm not saying these are not devastating cards. I'm agreeing with you. I'm just saying they haven't hurt me specifically.
That's because no one's used them against you like that.
I only have Notion Thief in I think one of my decks now. I think I might have to put it in all of my black-blue X decks now just to get Preston with it. Like I started taking them out of my decks because I was like, they're kind of salty. They kind of make people attack me and stuff. Like, I don't want to draw the hate. I don't want to screw over everyone's fun. I think I'm just going to have to start putting them in all my decks again just to get Preston with them.
I only have it in one deck.
All right, next up is one I'd like to see a lot more of because I feel like the options we have aren't great. So this is... Oh, I just accidentally closed our document. This is land ramp nerfing. There's a few cards that do this. The 2 main ones we're going to talk about are Opposition Agent and Confounding Conundrum. So Confounding Conundrum is a 2-mana enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, draws a card. So at least it replaces itself if nothing else. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, if that player had another land enter the battlefield under their control this turn, they return a land they control to its owner's hand. And then Opposition Agent is a 3-mana creature with flash that says you control your opponents while they're searching their library. While an opponent is searching their library, they exile the card they find, and you may play those cards for as long as they remain exiled, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast them. So if your opponent is trying to Rampant Growth, Cultivate, anything like that, this lets you get that land, and you stop them from getting it. Confounding Conundrum specifically is really funny with that stuff. It's like, oh yeah, you can go find those lands from your deck, but when they enter, you're going to have to bounce one of your lands back to your hand. Confounding Conundrum, I've gone back and forth on, because on one hand, it's only 2 mana. It draws you a card, so it at least replaces itself. And it nerfs the green decks a little bit. But the problem is it also hits fetch lands, which if someone's just fairly playing in Evolving Wilds feels bad. But like the green deck is still going to get their landfall triggers. Like, yeah, their lands are all going to go to their hand, but they're still going to get the landfall triggers. They still hit the battlefield. And then Opposition Agent
might make that better with Confounding Conundrum.
Right, exactly. You're nerfing the fair Evolving Wilds player while letting the green player go off with their landfall. And then Opposition Agent, I think, has the problem of awkward timing, because you never know when you're actually supposed to play it. Like, do you hold it for the Demonic Tutor? Do you just crack it for the Evolving Wilds early game? Like, it's hard to time it, because once it's on the battlefield, no one's going to play into it, because it's there and it's obvious. So I would like to see more cards that do the things that these two cards are trying to do, but I don't think either of them are very good. I think they're both very easy to play around.
I think Confounding Conundrum, because it's like specifically talking about the land ramp part of it, it really isn't going to be, it's not as like difficult as it reads to play around, you know, because you might think, oh man, I can't ramp or put more lands onto the battlefield. I mean, playing 1 land a turn is often enough for excuse me. Playing 1 land a turn is often enough for any deck to continue to do its thing and then work towards the win. You know, not every deck is going to be trying to put extra lands onto the battlefield, so this really isn't going to hurt that much. It's not going to provide, you know, anybody with more advantage or not. Because, I mean, if anything, this honestly, this kind of feels more like a white card than a blue card, because it's really just trying to balance the table, keep everything equal, and not allow one player to add more to their board than any other player is normally allowed to do. I do like that it replaces itself and it is fairly cheap to cast, but honestly, this hits the table. Depending on the deck that I'm playing, I'm like, this isn't that big of a problem. Because like, even if you,
I was gonna say,
no, go ahead.
If you're playing fetch lands and you don't want this to hurt you, you just crack them on someone else's turn, and it doesn't matter. I just
That's true.
realized that.
Yeah,
So.
I guess that's true. So maybe Confounding Conundrum just sucks.
But Opposition Agent, because of the flash, is super difficult to play around. If you're the one casting it, you know, finding the right time to play it, it can be tricky. But strictly as an opponent trying to play around this, there almost is no way to play around this because it has flash. Taking control of an opponent's turn while they're doing anything is incredibly powerful, because I mean, in that moment, like, not only, so what it means to control a player's turn is you also got to look at their hand. So Opposition Agent has some added value because of that. Now you're getting all the information that your opponent already has. Without the exact knowledge of knowing what's in their deck, you know what's in their hand, and you know what you could grab that would either really, really hurt them or really, really help them. Because you are controlling your opponents while they're searching. So maybe you don't have to just find a basic land every single time that somebody searches. Maybe you could help them out and find something else that they need to kind of make a deal with them. I don't hurt you as bad with this, and you don't do me. So, there is definitely situations like that, but Opposition Agent is so tricky to play around. It's just so difficult.
Yeah, Preston, do you have much experience playing against Opposition Agent? Because I know that like it's in a couple decks in our play group, but I feel like we really don't see it that often.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has come out once or twice and it has hurt me, but I just don't have as much experience playing against it, so I can't really say as much confidently.
What would you guys say about having more cards like this in the future? Because I feel like green is just so far and above the best color in casual commander that we should have more answers to, punishing them a little bit. And the real answer would be print basic land hate, blow up all their forests, but like that's not fun. That's miserable. So I feel like these kind of cards could be the answer, but I feel like neither of these by themselves do it. And I feel like we just don't have that. There's also the white one, like Archivist of Ogma, I think is what it is, which is whenever an opponent searches their library, you draw a card and gain a life. So that one's fine. There are other cards that do it, but I feel like that's not enough to offset the advantage. So what would you guys say about maybe making more cards like this in the future that maybe are a little better?
I think more cards like this need to exist, but I think that these are two ends of a spectrum, and we really need to find more middle ground, because Confounding Conundrum isn't powerful enough to punish the player who's land ramping or trying to land ramp. Just bouncing it to their hand, like you guys were talking about it earlier, it can enable their deck, but also just not playing extra lands on your turn and living off one land drop a turn isn't the end of the world, because that's what most people are going to do anyways. So I think it's on the too weak end of the spectrum, but I think Opposition Agent is a little bit too strong just
really?
because it's a big feel bad. I'm not a big fan of cards that are just feel bads. And this really goes back to it having flash and being able to play with a spell on the stack. You cast your Demonic Tutor because you're going to win the game, or you need to search for something that's going to help you stabilize, or whatever you're searching for it. Now your opponent gets to search for anything that they want instead, and it's not having control of something that you're doing, but then also losing a card that could be your best card in your deck. I think that it's just it definitely meets the criteria that you're talking about, where it's punishing the player for doing something powerful. But I just think that it's a little bit too feel baddy and too mean.
But once it's there, you just hold off on your ramp until the Opposition Agent dies, right? Like, yeah, the person who gets got with the flash, yeah, like obviously that sucks, but like then it's really easy to play around. So let me ask you this to tie it more in theme with the episode: is if your opponent has 3 mana up and at least one of it's black, and you have a ramp spell, do you play into it, or do you hold off in case they have the Opposition Agent?
I think if it's mono black, then maybe you assume an Opposition Agent is a possibility. But outside of that, I don't know if you're going to expect this in an average deck just because it has black in it. And maybe you do. Maybe that depends on your play group. But I just don't know that it's getting played in every deck just because it has black in it.
I don't play around it if I'm doing a land tutor, because if you're using your Opposition Agent to mess up a land tutor, that's just bad play. You should use it for like an actual tutor.
I don't even know if that's always true, because if you're playing like a sure.
Specific, sorry. If I'm like cultivating or something and you use Opposite Agent, that's probably a waste because it's gonna die before you hit an actual tutor.
Yeah, but like another player having an Urborg on the battlefield and they crack their expedition map, so they're going to go find their Cabal coffers, that's a perfect time to use an Opposition Agent.
Yeah, no, that's
or even if they're, or even like this is a little more salt-inducing than that example, but like if they're like a 5-color deck and they kept their hand because they have maybe they don't have perfect fixing, but then they have like Farseeker or 3 Visits or something in their hand, so that they're like, oh,
Myriad
I'll
Landscape.
go find the Triome I need to fix my mana, and then you Oppo Agent them there. That can throw them off for the rest of the game. So there are situations where you would just use it on a like more fair card.
I just thought about a situation where it's like a 2-color deck and they only have one of their colors and they play the Myriad Landscape to go find 2 of their other colors, and then you flash in the opposition agent and they just don't get the other 2 colors. You're just like, all right, I have my 2 green. I'm gonna tap those, sacrifice the Myriad Landscape, go search for 2 blue. It's like, actually, you're gonna get 2 more green.
Yep. I I remember on a few seasons ago on Commander Clash, they would always play around Krim having opposition agent, because like every time he would have it every game somehow. Like the Magic Online shuffler was in his favor. Like Jason is the in live person of the arena shuffler. And there was one game where they're like, oh, Krim only has 1 mana right now. We're fine. We'll cast the ramp spell. I think it was Tomer.
No way.
I think it was Tomer. And then he dark
Ritual.
He dark ritual.
Oh,
Agent. It was awesome. It was freaking awesome. Okay, so a lot of these are things that are easy enough to answer, but they are kind of the spot removal checks, right? Like a lot of these cards that we're talking about today are enchantments. And if you're an enchantment, what are you supposed to do? Like if you're a blue player, you have to counter it, or maybe you could bounce it. Some cards could let you bounce it, but people don't really play a lot of bounce spells in Commander outside of Psych Rift. And then red can't really deal with enchantments. Black,
red is more redirect.
Yeah, and then black doesn't really have enchantment removal outside of like Feed the Swarm. So what are you supposed to don't you have to lean harder into playing around these the hard way if you're one of those colors, if you're not playing white or if you're not playing green? That just feels kind of bad. But what do you guys think about that? The fact that a lot of these are just like spot removal checks. Like if you don't have the answer, your opponent who has one of these cards is going to run away with the game. Like, are you going to put, like, if you are in these colors, do you start playing bad cards in your deck just in case you have to answer one of these? Or do you just hope that your opponent's not going to draw these cards?
The only thing that I could say that, like, there's not a whole lot of popular ways to do that, because I think about, like, discard effects, where you get to look at an opponent's hand and they have to discard a card, or milling. There's definitely a lot more mill in Commander than there has been before, but it's still not something that you see all the time, and when you do see it, it's usually self-mill. So if you're not in the right colors where you can deal with these types of things, you almost just have to, pray that they don't get it.
You can always try to get better at politicking and have one of your opponents deal with it. Being good at politics is one of the most important skills in Commander. So.
A one-off card we should talk about is Teferi's Protection, all right? This is a card that it gets people all the frickin' time. It's a card that is very heavily played. We see it all the time on our show. It's in almost all of the white decks in our play group. For 2 and a white, it's an instant that says, until your next turn, your life total can't change, and you gain protection from everything. All permanents you control phase out, and then you exile it, so at least you can't loop it. Except sometimes. Preston found a couple sneaky ways to reuse the T-Pro before. So you have lethal on board. Your opponent has 3 mana up and at least one of it's white. Do you go for it? Because the problem is there are times where people T-Pro just to buy themselves another turn and they're dead on the next turn anyways. But a lot of the times I have lethal, I swing to kill the person with the T-Pro, they T-Pro, and then they kill me on their turn because they have enough retaliation that they can finish the job. So that's where it gets tricky. So assuming you're not playing blue, I think if you're in that situation and you're a blue player, you find your counterspell and you hold up the mana for the counterspell. But if you're not doing that, do you go for it? Yes or no?
I think you have to evaluate the board and see, okay, if they do have it, what's the crackback going to be like? If it's like, they have a couple of setup pieces and they're going to play the Teferi's Protection just so they live one more turn to hopefully draw something else that's going to do it, then absolutely you swing them out, you send everything at them, you force them to use it, and don't give them an opportunity to save it while trying to rebuild. Now, if they have a board presence and they're going to be able to hit you for a lot, or if they're not attacking you with creatures, they're going to be able to cast spells or activate abilities that are going to make you lose the game. Wait. Then you maybe just hang back and see what they do and wait for them to either use up their mana on a turn, or you swing at them for a little bit more, or you swing at them for a little bit less than you would originally, or maybe you try and use one of your spot removal on one of their biggest pieces to try and draw it out. That's the best way for I would think to play around it if they have a board presence, is just try doing things that's going to draw it out.
Yeah, what do you think, Preston?
The smart player in me says, like, obviously look at the board. Are they gonna get you on the track? Like, what's their board look like, all that. But the actual person who plays in me is just gonna be like, make them have it.
Yeah.
I just always make them have it. If
No,
you
I
wanna
think
kill
that's
me,
true. Maybe
you
they
gotta
don't,
kill
right?
me. If you want to survive, you have to survive. I'm not playing this mind game thing. I'm just going for it, which is not correct, but it is what I am going to do every time because I find it more fun.
Here's the one thing I wanted to say about Teferi's Protection. The way that not an option you have to play around this is by dealing with the part where their permanents phase out. So an interesting thing with the rulings of phasing happens during your untap step. If you make them skip their untap step, their permanents will not phase back in. So, not that you should just throw a brine elemental into every single deck that you have that can run it, but that is an option that you have to play around the Teferi's Protection, because if you force them to skip their untap step, then all of their stuff isn't going to phase back in on their turn, which means their lands won't phase back in, so they can't play spells. Their creatures won't phase back in, so they won't have any blockers, and those blockers wouldn't untap anyways. There are enchantments that are giving them value, like their Smothering Tides aren't going to come back in. And so if you can make them skip their untap step, now you have an incredible advantage on that player. And they might have gotten away from it for one turn, but on your following turn after that, you should be able to either kill them or take them down a lot. So that's one thing that I hope that everybody kind of keeps in mind. If you didn't know it, now you know. Just make them skip their untap step if you can.
Are you gonna play cards that do that though, just because T-Pro's in 20% of white decks?
I think that it's not a bad option. One card out of 100 that does that as your answer for Teferi's Protection, because Teferi's Protection is just one card that saves you in a certain situation. So maybe it's worth slotting it into a deck. The one thing I do want to mention about that though is they won't phase back in on that turn, but during their next untap step, they will still phase back in, because the way phasing out, like with Teferi's Protection, works is during that player's next untap step. So if you make them skip one untap step, as long as they get another untap step on a different turn, or if they have cards that allow them to get another untap step on the same turn, they will still phase back in during that second instance of untap.
Yeah, the only other thing I would say about T-Pro is, and we have experience with this on our Commander show. There was a game where I had T-Pro in my hand for at least 2 turn rotations, and I got anyways because I was never given a good chance to crack it off. If you think someone has the T-Pro, don't full send. keep spreading the damage, chip them away little by little by little, so that they never have a time where they feel like they have to use it. So by the time that they finally do use it, it's too late. That happened to me on the Artifact episode. I had T-Pro. Everyone kept picking away at me. My life total was getting low, but there was never a point at like, I will die if I don't do this now. So I kept not doing it. But then by the time I finally did T-Pro, I just immediately died on the next person's turn anyways once I phased back in, because I had just been chipped away at long enough. So that's a good way to do it too, is if you think someone has T-Pro, don't full send at them. Just keep chipping away at them so they never have a time where they feel like they have to use it.
Also, you can still mess with their hands and libraries if it's not targeted. So, like, if you're playing a mill deck, you can still mill them out if it's like each player mills or each opponent mills. You can uptick poison counters with proliferate effects. So, there's a couple ways to get the Teferi protection.
Yeah, because proliferating the poison counters, for instance, isn't targeting. So even if that player had protection, it gets around that. Yeah. As far as playing around things as well, we also have counterspells and board wipes. As far as letting them have it, if you think someone has a counterspell, or if you think someone has a board wipe, how much will you let that affect what you are thinking about doing, right? Sometimes this is easy. Like sometimes someone has a counterspell because maybe it was in their graveyard or they returned it to your hand or whatever. Do you say, they're going to do it or they're not? Do you hold off until they're tapped out? If you're playing a creature deck and you think someone has a board wipe, are you going to continue to commit to the board, or are you going to hold some of your creatures back in your hand? What do you guys think about counterspells and board wipes?
At some point, you got to play the game. At some point, you got to play the game. You can't just not cast spells the entire time and hope to win. Like maybe you don't play stuff for a turn, or maybe you don't play as much stuff as you wanted to or could play on a turn. But at some point, you got to play the game. You got to make them use it if they have it, and you got to keep trying to work your way towards a win. And doing nothing is going to do neither of those things. Getting around board wipes is a little bit easier because you just don't cast your creatures unless we're talking about all-encompassing board wipes like Farewell. But, if we're just talking creature board wipes, you just don't play your creatures, play, your mana rocks or your planeswalkers or your artifacts or enchantments or whatever, and just kind of hold your creatures back until that board wipe pops off, and then you start building up your board more. But with counterspells especially, you got to play the game. If they got it, they got it. Your spell gets countered. I mean, you just gotta kind of force them to do it if they have it.
My most common go-to in games of Magic is like, I'll try to have enough mana to where I can do at least 2 things in a turn, and I will always send my first, second scarier thing out first, try to bait out the counterspell, and if they get rid of that, then I get to actually play the card I really wanted to play. Like, I do that all the time, really. If I think someone has a counterspell already, like that's my go-to most often than not.
Yeah, that's a trick I like to use. I think both Preston and I have both done that on the show before, where we've been able to bait out counterspells. So, yeah, and then board wipes, I kind of have the same mentality. I think for the most part, unless I specifically heard someone say I'm going to cast a board wipe on my turn. Unless someone said that, I'm just going to continue to commit to the board. Like, I'm a creature deck. I got to do the deck
maybe
thing.
Hold a creature or 2 back just so you have something ready to go next turn.
Yeah. Or if I have ways to, like, look for other cards, maybe I'm specifically looking for something that's going to help me build back in the event of a board wipe. But, yeah, for the most part, I'm just, you should just do what your decks came here to do. It's not as bad as a lot of the other cards we talked about today.
You play cards like Gaia's Ghost Form that'll return the creature when it dies, or you play any blue cards that'll bounce creatures to your hand to save them from the board wipe. You could do stuff like that.
So the last thing I want to talk about today is, Preston talked about this briefly, is do you ever play into these cards to make alliances? Like, do you ever say, hey, Jason, I won't pay for your Ristic study if you be my friend for a couple turns? Like, do you ever do that? Or do you think that it's probably wrong to do that because even if it comes down to a 1v1, it's just you, it's just you two left in the game, you drew them so many cards that they're probably just going to beat you anyways.
It depends on the time in the game. It depends on when it's happening. But early game, it honestly could be advantageous to make an alliance with the player who has one of these types of cards, because outside of a Shieldred or an Orcish Bowmaster or Trouble in Pairs, something that they don't have any control over and it's gonna affect you no matter what. For the Rhystic Studies or the Esper Sentinels or the Mystic Remoras, you could just be like, hey, I'll do this if you just don't use the cards that you draw against me. But for Notion Thief and Narset, you don't make deals with those players. You kill them and then you ban them from coming back.
Yeah, anything to add to that, Preston?
I one of the best parts about Commander is the whole politicking thing. So I like to make alliances. So yeah, I'm with Jason, especially early game. It can be actually genuinely good for you to work with that person. They're gonna get advantage anyways. You can be like, oh, I won't pay for this when you weren't going to pay anyways. Get something out of it. I do like doing that, so that's always fun.
Yeah, not to get too into spoilers, but there on the Patreon only episode of our Commander gameplay, there was a time where one of the players was really far ahead, and we knew we needed to find a board wipe ASAP, or we were all gonna die. And the other two players agreed to stop paying for Jason's Rhystic study so we could help find a board wipe. So that is something you can do. It is an option. All right. Well, I hope that this episode was helpful for you guys. If you guys find it helpful or would like to get more into this topic, this is something we could definitely revisit. We could talk about real stacks, how to play around harder stacks, cards that are even more brutal than these. But I feel like we see these more often. I feel like more on casual tables, you will still see these kind of cards. So, but if you would like us to continue that conversation, let us know in the comments. That's something we could definitely do. We will be back next week to talk about something else. I don't remember what for sure we decided on doing.
Mana Rocks.
Oh, yeah, we're doing a Mana Rock tier list. That's right. Thank you, Jason. We're doing a Mana Rock tier list. So tune in next week for that. And until then, we hope you guys have a great time. We'll see you later. Bye.